Welcome to ProCrafts, John here. Today we're talking about exposure. And what I mean by that is all the ways that your money is at risk. How many ways can you get beat at the craps table? Now this game is hard enough. There's a house edge built into it. The odds are certainly stacked against you. And honestly, like every other game at the casino, craps is designed to take your money, right? Let's not make it any easier for the casinos to do that by making bad decisions or playing poor strategies at the table. What I want to do here is take a deep look at how you build strategy and how you analyze and measure your exposure levels at each part of your strategy and your gameplay. I honestly believe if you don't really understand exposure, how it works and how it interacts with your bankroll, you'll have a really tough time winning and walking away not losing more than you probably should. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and break down exposure in a few different ways. We're going to break down a strategy and give you some tools in how to measure your exposure with your strategies. So let's get into it now and analyze exposure. And in my view, exposure really comes at you in three major factors, okay? The first one is depth. How deep into your bankroll are you? What percentage of your session money is out on the table and at risk for loss at any one point in time? That's the first piece, depth. The next piece is width. What I mean by width is, what is your coverage? How covered are you? How many numbers beat you? Okay, most of the time it's going to be the 7 if you're a right side player, but in many other strategies, other numbers can beat you, and sometimes the number that beats you changes during gameplay. So we want to make sure we're aware of what our width is, how covered are we, and what numbers beat us. And finally, the most important piece of exposure, I believe, is what I call length. And length tells me how long is a bet out here? How long might it be before that bet pays off? How long is my money at risk before I can either break even or show a profit? So length of time is a big one. And the three of those combined, how deep into your bankroll you are, how much money you have at risk, how long that money is going to be out there before it pays off or at least breaks even, and finally, what numbers are your risk numbers? What numbers can take that money? Those three things combined add up to what your exposure is, right? And when you analyze a strategy, you should look at your strategies in terms of all three of those factors. So what I want to do here now is take a little deeper look at each one of them, and we can use that as a way to analyze our strategies as we go ahead. Let's take a look at exposure in terms of depth now. So what I've got on the layout is a really simple strategy, $30, 6 and 8. Let's assume that this is your bankroll. Okay, you came to the casino with enough money to do this strategy for 5 shooters. You got 4 in the rack, you got 1 out here on the layout. And in this case, the math is pretty easy, right? You got 1/5 of your bankroll in action and at risk. So the depth of your exposure here is 20%. 20% of your session bankroll in this strategy is right now at risk. That's easy math. The second level of this though is how much, if you're gonna play, like most of us do, a strategy with a certain amount of spread or coverage per shooter. In this case, we've planned for $60 per shooter. In this example, all of that is out here, right? 100% of a shooter's money is at risk at this time. Not every strategy works that way. Some strategies you might have $60 and you piecemeal and you build as you go. So you don't have 100% of your money out there yet. You kind of build into it and work through it. So your depth of exposure on a per shooter might actually fluctuate throughout the course of a hand. But know that you've got 2 metrics here. 1, how much of your bankroll is at risk, and 2, how much of your per shooter allotment is at risk. And that's how you measure your depth of bankroll. We'll take a look at some bigger examples later on with differing amounts of money. And as we go through this, we'll make sure that we call out the percentages or the overall depth of bankroll as it changes. Let's analyze exposure now in terms of length. What I mean by that is the length of time that your money is out there at risk. So let's look at this simple example here of a place bet on the 6. Now the 6 has 5 ways to roll. The 7 has 6 ways to roll. If you look at the probability of that, that's 6 out of 36 or 1 out of 6. The 6 and its sister number, the 8, are 5 out of 36 or a little greater than 1 out of 7 chance for them to roll. The way that I measure exposure in these terms is how many times at worst would it be before I saw my number? Okay, here you've got 7 cracks at it, and the 6 may not come until the 7th one. 1 out of 7 chance, right? We're on a number, it might take 7 rolls to see it. On the 7, the other hand, has 6 ways to roll, and that might come on the 6th roll. If it does, and this waits till the 7th, you're done, right? That's length, how I look at length. And that seems like a pretty tall hill to climb. Now, luckily the dice don't roll always where it's on the worst possible case, but I always plan for the worst possible case. The worst case for the 6 is you see 7 rolls before it shows up. Now, how do you help mitigate that? One thing we can do for sure is we can add a place bet on the 8, because the 8 also has 5 ways to roll, which means between the 6 and the 8, you have 10 ways to get paid, which changes this number a little bit, right? 10 out of 36 is 3.4 or so. Let's call it 4. So now instead of 1 every 7 rolls, where you might see a 6, now you say 1 out of every 4 rolls, I might see either one of them, because you reduce that down a little bit. Okay? It's not perfect math. It doesn't always work this way. But when I think of length of time, by adding a second number, I reduce the length of time that I'm likely to see a score hit against the 7, which has not changed how often it's going to appear. You can also add a 5 and a 9 to that, right? The inside betting is a very popular way to go. The 5 and 9 each have 4 ways to win, making their total number of possibilities here. Let's put that out here. Now you've got 18 ways to win between the 5, the 9, the 6, and the 8 all together. There's 18 ways to win. That's 1 out of every 2, which means the likelihood of one of these numbers hitting is every other roll, if you can get across like this. So that's a way to reduce, again, time. Time before you start seeing money come back to your rail. And that's what this is all about for me. How soon can I pull money back to my rail? So when you've got fewer numbers out here, right? When you're back in the world where you've just got one number, right? We're back here. That's tough. One number is going to take the worst possible case. In our case here, 7 hits, 7 rolls before that 8 might pay out. So protect yourself in terms of length of time. When you're building your strategies, there's a butter zone that you'll find. That's not necessarily every single number, but it's also for sure not only one number. So length of time is a big one. How long can you expect to be out here before you start seeing some money come back to your rail? That's a really big deal. Finally, let's analyze exposure in terms of width, or how wide is your exposure? How many numbers beat you? And as I mentioned earlier, you can get beat by multiple numbers at the same time, multiple numbers during the course of a roll. Okay, so let's take a look at how this works. We'll go back to the basic 6 and 8 bet, right? Let's have just a bet on the 6. And right now, what are you exposed to? This is a clear one. When you're placing numbers, you're exposed to the 7. That's it. So knowing what beats you, big deal in terms of looking at overall exposure. But what if we weren't doing this? What if we were going through the more standard kind of way of playing and we're betting on the pass line? What if we're on the pass line? What is our exposure right now in terms of width? What number beats you? The number that beats you right now is the 2, the 3, and the 12. You have 3 numbers that beat you on the pass line. Your exposure right now is 3 numbers. The 3 is able to be rolled in 2 different combinations. So there's 4 ways that you can lose this bet right now on the come out roll. Once the come out happens, things change. If we go, for example, to the 5, what is our exposure now? Our exposure now changes to the 6 ways to roll a 7. So it's moved. Once the number is established, your exposure changes. You're now exposed to a different number that beats you. Okay, be aware of that. The same can be said on the don't pass. If you're betting on the don't pass and the puck is off, on the come out, you can get beat by both the 7 and the 11. So here you've got actually 8 ways to lose that bet. Once a point has been established, that goes away. And what beats you now is the number of combinations on the number that got hit. So your exposure on the pass line and the don't pass, right, change as the roll happens. The same can be said if you're coming through the come bet. If you're coming through the come, the same situation applies as it did on the don't and the pass line, just that it's happening during a roll while a number is established. And here, You're exposed again to the 2 ways to roll the 3, and the 12. Once that number moves to a different number, once the shooter has established a new point for you internally, that changes. And now you're exposed again to the 6 ways to roll the 7. So again, this come betting changes exposure in midstream, the same as the don't come. The don't come does the same thing. You start out by being exposed to the 7 and the 11. If this moves behind a number because the shooter has rolled some box number, now it changes. And what are you exposed to in this case? Your exposure now shifts to the 5 ways to roll the 6. For that one, let's say you have a second come bet or a second don't come bet. This moves behind the 9. Okay? For the period of time that it was in here, look at your exposure when you're doing this kind of a strategy. Let's actually roll this out here, right? In this situation, this bet is exposed to the 5 ways to roll the 6. This bet is exposed to the 6 ways to roll the 6 and the 2 ways to roll the 11. It's a lot of exposure. Simple little strategy like multiple don't come bets. Look at what happens to you when you're doing this kind of a strategy, right? You were exposed to the 6 and the 11, you beat it, and you got out here. Now you're exposed to the 6 on that bet. Let's try that again. We come into the don't come a second time. We're exposed again to the 6 and the 11, right? Once it gets set to the 9 or some other number, let's say, now you're exposed to the 4 ways to roll that number. So in this situation, your exposure level changes based on what's happening during the roll. If you're going to be betting the come or the don't come, you can expect your exposure to shift as you go. Another betting style that has varying exposure is when you're betting in the hop or the propositions areas. Let's take a look at that on my board here. So the propositions area is normally used when somebody's coming out. Okay, so let's say that you're, again, a pass line bettor, and because you know that the 2, the 3, and the 12 are the numbers that beat you, you might bet here on any craps, or the C. You might bet on the hop numbers directly, on the 1, the 3, and the 12. Okay? In either one of those cases, those are one roll bets. We call them hop bets. In this case, your exposure in terms of length of time for a bet such as that is one roll. It's a one roll risk for a pretty small depth. You're putting $3 at risk for one roll in hopes to protect another bet. Now what happens here, and I want you to remember this math, when you do this to protect the pass line bet on the come out roll, and the shooter does set a number, let's say it's the 9, these bets go away. Okay? Obvious, you're going to lose those bets. It's a one roll bet, those numbers didn't hit, the bets go bye-bye. Now what happened mathematically is that this bet here is no longer a $25 bet. Okay? Rather, that bet is now worth how much money? It's worth $22 because you lost $3 over here to save it. Remember that when you're talking about hedging some bets, and I think it's a pretty common thing, when you hedge a bet over here or anywhere else on the table, when the hedge loses, as it did in that case, it reduces the power of the bet that it was protecting to start with. So we went from a $25 pass line bet to really an effective bet of $22 because we lost 3 to protect it. So when you're thinking about exposure and you're calculating your win percentage or what your expected value is on a given strategy, remember that when you're hopping things like this, that does have a negative impact on the bet that you are protecting. So keep that in mind. You can also hop any number. You know, I could actually bet, I'm sure you can see it, but I can bet the 6 and the 8, and I can hop, I don't have hops on my table, but I could hop the 5 for $5 each for the 4-1 and the 2-3. You can do that. It's a one roll bet. It's a pretty high risk bet, pays a lot more, but you can hop bets. And when you do that, again, your exposure in terms of depth, in this case it's $10, whatever percentage of your bankroll that is, for you to calculate. The length of time that this bet is at risk is 1, right? It's at risk to the 7, and it's volatile, right? That's a one roll bet. Anytime you're hopping any kind of bet, it's a volatile situation. It's a one roll kind of swing and a miss. We'll see what happens here, or it's a swing and it's a home run either way. So that's, again, when you're calculating your strategies and you're going to use hop bets or protection bets, remember what you're doing in terms of the length of time that's out there. It's a very short length of time, but it's super high risk because it's a one roll and done situation. I'd like to do an example breakdown of a strategy so we can look at and calculate the exposure of the strategy as we go. I've picked one that's got a lot of moving parts to it. It's a really fun strategy to play, but more importantly, because the exposure changes while we're playing, I think it's a good example for what we're talking about here. The strategy that I've chosen here is called I Can't Believe This Wins. It's a strategy put out by Larry Casper, Crappy the Craftsman, great YouTube channel. Really funny guy, folksy, great strategies. This is one of my favorites of his because it does have a lot of moving parts and it's fun to play. So here's how it lays out. We start out with, we go 160 across. We're gonna go bets on the 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 10. Now, we'll get a point established first. Our point's gonna be 5. So this strategy starts out like a normal strategy, okay? Your exposure here is pretty intense, right? That's $160 out there. That's quite a bit of spread and a lot of coverage. So your bankroll, if this is part of a $1,000 bankroll, you're probably okay, but that's quite a deep exposure to start with, okay? What are we exposed to? We're exposed to the 7, okay? Every number out here gets beat by the 7. That's pretty clear. And as far as length goes, you've got all the numbers covered, right? All the inside or the box numbers. You've got 10 ways to win the 6 and the 8. You've got 8 ways to win the 5 and the 9. That's 18. Plus 6 ways to win the 4 and the 10, 3 each. It brings your total number of possible winning combinations to 24 out of 36. So you're getting close to 1 every 2, 2.5 or so rolls, you should see a score hit, which is good. So from a length standpoint, it shouldn't be long before you start seeing money come back off the table. That's a good part of the strategy. Now, what we do here with this strategy is as you're taking wins, what you're doing is you're going to pull your money off the table, so reduce your depth of exposure with every single hit, yet take your winnings and move them to the don't come. And what he does is he kind of works the backside of the table, getting the 7 to work for him as the roll goes on. The longer the roll goes, the more 7 coverage he has. And it's kind of an interesting play. So let's roll it out and we'll see what happens here. So we've got a point of 5. We roll a 6. Now the 6 is going to pay $35. What we'll do here is we'll take down our bet and our winnings. I'll put the winnings down here so we can see them. The initial bet goes back into the don't come. So we've reduced, right, our initial like spread or coverage of the numbers, and we're going to start getting a number working for us. Now we've changed our exposure a little bit. We've added something here. We're still exposed to the 7 here. We're also exposed to the 7 here. So that basic 7 exposure is still there. This bet is also exposed to the 11. We've added a 1 roll exposure to the 11 here. Now, once this gets set behind the number, our exposure number will change here. Let's get it set. Well, we don't get it set. We lose to the 7 here. I'm going to roll it again because I want you to see how this changes once we're behind a number. It'll be behind a 10. Let's just kind of play this out. So this goes behind the 10. The 10 is going to get paid. We'll call it 50 for 1. We're not going to do the VIGs here. And we pull down that win. The initial bet moves to the don't come. Following all this activity, let's take a look at what's happened. We've pulled back a win from the 10. We've pulled back a win from the 6. We've got some extra money in our bankroll. We've put a second chip in the don't come. This is now exposed to the 7 and the 11. This $30 here is exposed only to the 10. Because this covers, this wins on the 7, effectively these cancel out for 1 roll. This chip, although it will lose on the 7, we win over here, so there's a cancellation here. So from an exposure standpoint, what's actually exposed to the 7 are just the 4 box numbers that are remaining for this 1 roll. Okay, so that exposure level has changed a little bit. We'll roll it again. We get to the 9. This moves behind the 9. The 9 is going to get paid $35. And again, we'll take this and we'll pull it down, move the chip into the don't come. And once again, we're at the same point where we have 1, 2, 3, 4 bets that expose to the 7. However, this bet is covered by one of these 2. So really, this chip is not a concern for the 7. The 7 is what gets that one. We'll roll again. We're back behind the 8. This goes behind the 8. 8's going to pay 35. And again, we'll take our profit down. We'll move the original bet to the don't come. And once again, exposure changes a little bit. Our depth of exposure is getting smaller and smaller as we go, right? We've gotten, remember, we started out with $160 in spread, right? What we've got here is 50, 1, 25, 35, 45, 55. We're basically covered. This essentially, we've pulled back out of 4 hits, our initial spread, and now we're starting, everything now that comes back is profit. So this strategy took 4 hits to break itself even, and we've increased, we've got 1, 2, 3 bets on the 7 now. What's our exposure? These 3 are exposed to the 7. These 3 are exposed to the 8, 9, and 10 respectively. So we're changing the numbers that beat us as we go through the strategy. We'll take another roll here and see what happens. Goes behind the 10, so we're gonna lose this and replace it so that one of our danger numbers actually caused us harm. That's okay, we still have 3 bets here on the 7. Our danger numbers are still 10, 9, 8, and the 7. We'll roll it out again. Another 10, so that's actually kind of a hot number here. There's a 4. We get paid in the 4, so the 4 will pay 50. The flat bet goes, the original bet goes in, and now we're showing profit in our rack, and we're still, again, exposure change. This one here was exposed to the 7. It goes to the 9. That bet now loses because the danger number was a 9 and we rolled it. A couple more shots here. There's our 7. So the 7 takes the 5, but the 8 and the 9 will pay off. And there's your outcome from the I can't believe this win strategy. This thing essentially doubles your money. So let's take a look. There's 100, 50, 60. That's our initial out. And what we've collected back from this thing is 125, 35, 145 bucks. We almost doubled our output with this strategy. And again, it's not about the strategy that I'm talking about. It's the exposure measurement that we're looking at, right? We started out with a pretty deep exposure, 160 bucks. I'd rate that on a scale of 1 to 3. I'd give it a 3. That's a pretty large amount of money there. And again, 3 being I'm scared, 1 being I don't care, okay? That morphed. And as we went through this thing, the more hits we took and brought money back to our rack, the more we brought back each time, that depth of exposure went from a 3 down to a 1 once we were out of the hand and broke even. From a length standpoint, as you can see, we did take the early 7 there, and I know that this is kind of a false win because I didn't remove the bets after the early 7. I wanted to kind of keep the thing rolling so you could see how the measurement goes. From a length standpoint, though, besides that one roll, you're really every other roll, you're seeing something positive because you have so many numbers covered. So when you have casting a wider net, your length of exposure goes down because you have a more frequent hit rate, which is good. And yeah, so from a width standpoint, you were covered, you were exposed to the 7, but as we got numbers set behind, that changed. The 7 began to work for us, and other numbers in smaller scale worked against us. So you were exposed to more numbers, but on a smaller scale. The 7's power was reduced as we got more bets set behind. So again, from that standpoint, I think that strategy goes from a 2 to a 3 at different points, and maybe down to a 1 at the end when all you have left is 7's bets on the donut up here. So that's a fun one to analyze, and I would challenge you to take the strategies that you like to play and give them the same sort of grading schedule, right? If you're just an inside bettor and you're just betting like so on the inside, and all you're doing is same betting every time, it's a 4 hit to get your money back, right? If you're gonna press, and then collect, more of a double tap type of thing, your exposure level will change in terms of depth at a different rate than somebody else's. If you're doing this along with a don't pass, perhaps, your exposure changes as well. This hedge reduces some of the effectiveness of the 7 up here. So as you're going through your strategy building, measure your exposure on that 3 scale. 1 meaning I don't care, 3 meaning I'm really scared, and somewhere in the middle is where you're shooting for to kind of keep yourself at a lower risk, or manage your risk at the level you can tolerate and that your bankroll can withstand. So Again, that's a great look at exposure with a couple of simple strategies here. And I think that will help you with a good example of how you can measure your own as you go through your strategy building process. Well, that was pretty interesting breaking down that strategy. A lot of moving parts there, but really getting a chance to analyze our exposure at each level I thought was pretty cool. So if you've got another way to analyze exposure, or if you want to tell us how you stack up measuring exposure this way, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Appreciate your likes, your subscriptions. It all helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching, and hopefully we'll see you at the tables.